He smiled at her like she was the most inconvenient item on his schedule. That was the first thing Zuri Thompson noticed. Not the words, not the calm voice explaining how he'd signed papers that morning for another woman. Not the way the sole afternoon light cut through the car window and made everything look ordinary when nothing would ever be ordinary again. She noticed the smile. Easy. Practiced. The same smile he used in boardrooms when he was about to restructure something that no longer served him. She was still holding the dress bag. White satin. $4,200. She'd picked it up an hour ago. Kang Min-jae had just told her he was already married. If you've ever trusted someone with your entire life, not just your heart, but your time, your work, your silence, your forgiveness, and watched them look you in the eye and explain why that was never going to be enough, then you already know what Zuri felt sitting in that car. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. This is her story. Stay with it until the end, because the woman you're about to meet doesn't break, she builds. If this story reaches you today, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The dress fitting had run 40 minutes long because the seamstress kept finding small things to fix. A seam near the left shoulder, a clasp that didn't lie flat against Zuri's back. Zuri hadn't minded. She'd stood in front of that mirror with the kind of patience that comes from 10 years of learning how to be still when everything around her was moving fast, and she'd looked at herself in white satin and thought, finally. She was 34 years old. She'd spent the last decade of her life inside the architecture of someone else's empire, writing code in the early morning hours while Min-jae slept, solving problems that his most trusted lieutenants couldn't touch, building an AI surveillance platform from concept drawings on the back of hotel stationery that eventually became the technological backbone of a corporation worth several $100 million. She'd done all of that. She had not complained about most of it. She told herself it was partnership. She told herself it was love. The ring on her finger was 3 carats. Real. Min-jae had proposed in the living room of the apartment she'd designed, on one knee, in a moment she'd replayed so many times it had worn grooves into her memory. He was waiting outside the bridal shop in the black SUV she knew better than her own reflection. She gathered the dress bag over her arm, thanked the seamstress, and walked out into the gray October afternoon feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to light. She opened the car door and slid in. The dress bag went across her lap. Min-jae didn't look up from his phone immediately, and she thought nothing of it. He was always on his phone. She'd learned to read his silences the way other people read weather. What this one means, what that one costs, which ones to wait out, and which ones to interrupt. This one felt different. She registered that somewhere low in her chest, the way you register a change in air pressure before a storm. How was it? He said, still not looking at her. Good, they finally got the shoulder right. She smoothed the bag across her knees. We're still on for dinner with Ji-hoon and his wife Thursday? He set the phone down on the center console. Still didn't look at her. The driver pulled away from the curb. 3 blocks of silence. She watched Seoul move past the window. Shop fronts, foot traffic, a cluster of school kids in matching jackets. She was thinking about the centerpieces. Whether ivory candles were the right choice, or whether they read as too formal against the modern lines of the venue. I married Seoa this morning. She heard the words. Her brain processed them in the technical sense. Sound converted to meaning, meaning attached to content. But for a full 3 seconds, she sat completely still, because some part of her was certain she'd misheard. She turned and looked at him. His face was composed. That was the thing that would stay with her longest. How composed he was. Not cold exactly. Not cruel, in the way that shows. Just settled. Like he'd worked through the harder part of this conversation in his head and arrived here already finished with the difficult section. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice was quieter than she expected. Han Seo-ah. He said the name the same way he said everything, without excess, without apology. She required a legal marriage before accepting the formal role. Her family wouldn't have it any other way. It was a civil ceremony, small, this morning. The dress bag was still on her lap. She stopped, started again. You got married, this morning. It's administrative, Zuri. He looked at her now, and his eyes were steady, and she hated him in that moment for how steady his eyes were. Nothing between us changes. What we have is 10 years. Seoa has a certificate. Those are not the same thing. She stared at him. The wedding next week, she started, can still happen. He said it like he was solving a logistics problem. The venue's booked. The guests are confirmed. You've put significant work into the planning. It doesn't have to be wasted. You could... He paused, genuinely pausing, as if he was being thoughtful. Find someone else to stand with you, a friend, a colleague, someone presentable. The celebration doesn't have to be canceled just because the formal arrangement has changed. Zuri sat in that car while Sol moved past the windows, and her brain tried to build a structure around what she was hearing and couldn't. She thought about the centerpieces again, absurdly. Ivory candles, 48 of them. She'd chosen them herself. She thought about the ultrasound in her handbag, the one she'd had done 4 days ago, the one she'd been carrying around like a secret she was waiting for the right moment to tell. 8 weeks. A small heartbeat, strong and fast on the screen. She'd cried a little in the doctor's office, and the technician had handed her tissues and smiled like she understood. She did not take the ultrasound out of her bag. She said nothing for a long time, long enough that the driver, a man who'd worked for Min Jae for 6 years and had certainly navigated uncomfortable silences before, kept his eyes locked on the road with the focused commitment of someone who wanted very badly to be invisible. Say something, Min Jae said. Not gently, not cruelly, just like a man waiting for a response so the conversation could move forward. Zuri looked at her hands on the dress bag. Her knuckles were not white. She was surprised by that. She thought they'd be white. I need you to take me home, she said. Zuri, my apartment. She hadn't lived there in 3 years, had kept the lease because Min Jae paid it, and she'd never entirely stopped needing the option of it. Take me to my apartment. He studied her the way he studied acquisition proposals, looking for the flaw in the position, the leverage point, the place where pressure would produce a different result. He found nothing to work with in her face. She made sure of it. He nodded once at the driver, who redirected without a word. She did not cry in the car. She would tell herself later that this was not strength, it was shock, and there's a difference, and confusing the two is dangerous because shock eventually wears off. But she sat straight, and she watched Sol through the window, and when Min Jae tried twice more to explain the situation, administrative, nothing changes, 10 years means more than a certificate, she let the words land somewhere outside herself and didn't answer them. He walked her to the apartment building entrance. He put his hand on her arm and she looked at it until he removed it. I'll give you a few days, he said, like he was the one being generous. You'll see this clearly when the emotion settles. She went inside. She did not look back. The apartment smelled like it had been closed for too long. She turned on one lamp and sat on the edge of the couch and stayed there for a while, not crying, not thinking clearly, just existing inside the wreckage of an afternoon that had started with a dress fitting and ended with the complete restructuring of her understanding of her own life. She was 34. She'd been with Min Jae since she was 24, since she was a software engineer fresh out of a prestigious Chicago program, brilliant and ambitious and naive enough to believe that a man who saw how good she was at building things would also understand her value as a person. She'd come to Seoul on a work visa for a 6-month contract position with a tech startup. She'd met Kang Min Jae at a private corporate event. He was 32 then, already feared in certain circles, already building something that operated on 2 levels. The clean corporate face and the structure beneath it that nobody discussed at dinner parties. He'd looked at her across that room and said simply, "You're the one who wrote the anomaly detection algorithm for Hanseong Logistics." Nobody had ever opened with that. She'd been charmed instantly, and she'd been embarrassed about being charmed instantly ever since. She'd stayed. 6 months became a year. He brought her inside the real operation, not the criminal infrastructure, not at first, but the technological architecture of it. He'd needed someone with her specific combination of skills: AI systems design, cybersecurity, financial data routing. He'd offered her resources she couldn't have accessed anywhere else: labs, servers, a team, money. She'd built things she was genuinely proud of, things that existed nowhere else in the world. And she'd loved him, imperfectly, with full knowledge that he was not a simple man or a safe one, but she'd loved him. She'd accepted the way he operated, the men who moved through their house at strange hours, the calls that required her to leave certain rooms, The parts of his world she was permitted to understand and the parts that remained closed. She'd accepted it because the parts she was given felt real, because he'd come home to her, because he'd gotten on one knee in the living room she'd designed. She put her hand on her stomach now, alone in the apartment. 8 weeks. She picked up her phone. She looked at it for a long time. She had the number of a man named Park Ji-hoon, a veteran attorney who had handled 3 separate confidentiality matters for Min-jae over the years, and who had, on each occasion, looked at Zuri with an expression that suggested he understood more about her situation than she did. She'd saved his number 2 years ago for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself at the time. She called him now. It rang 4 times. He answered on the 5th. "Ms. Thompson," he said, like he'd been expecting this eventually. "I need to know," she said without introduction, "what my actual ownership position is on the AI surveillance platform and the affiliated cybersecurity patents." A pause. Not surprised, more like a man choosing his words carefully. "I'd need to pull the original licensing agreements," he said. "But from what I understand of the arrangement, the royalty-free license, Min-jae, operates under expires." "On the 24th, she said. "The day of the wedding." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," Park Ji-hoon said carefully. "That's my understanding as well." Zuri looked at the dress bag, still in her hand, white satin catching the lamplight. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." "I'll clear my schedule," he said. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her lap and the dress bag at her feet and thought about ivory candles and patent registrations and a heartbeat on an ultrasound screen, strong and fast. She thought about the way Min-jae had smiled at her in the car, easy, practiced. She thought about what he'd said to her once, 3 years into their arrangement, during an argument she'd partially won. "You're not going anywhere, Zuri. You know that. I know that. Let's stop performing for each other." He'd believed it. He'd believed it completely and consistently for 10 years. He'd believed it so thoroughly that he'd signed a marriage certificate for another woman on a Tuesday morning and then sat in a car and explained to her why nothing had changed. The thing about being underestimated by someone who loves you is that it's a particular kind of wound. It doesn't announce itself cleanly. It compounds. Each instance lays down a layer until the structure is thick enough to feel like the foundation of the relationship itself. She opened her handbag. She took out the ultrasound image. She held it for a moment under the lamplight. That small gray shape, that fast heartbeat already printed and still. She put it back. She zipped the bag. She would tell him about the pregnancy when she was ready, and not a moment before, and she would decide on her own terms what that information meant and who it served. For now, she had a meeting to prepare for. She opened her laptop, and she began. Park Ji-hoon's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam that smelled like old wood and expensive paper, the kind of place where people came to formalize the worst moments of their lives. Zuri arrived at 7:45 in the morning, before his assistant, before anyone. She'd barely slept. She'd sat at her laptop until 3 a.m., pulling every document she could access from her own encrypted archive. Development logs, commit histories, patent filing receipts, the original licensing agreement she'd signed with Min-jae's corporation 8 years ago when the platform was still a prototype running on borrowed server space. She'd read that agreement 3 times. Then a 4th. Park Ji-hoon arrived at 8 sharp, found her in the hallway outside his locked office, and said nothing about the fact that she looked like she hadn't closed her eyes. He unlocked the door, gestured her in, set down his briefcase, and put water on before he sat. "Walk me through it," he said. So she did. 40 minutes, no interruptions. She laid the documents on his desk in the order she'd organized them the night before, chronological, clean, each one flagged with a sticky note marking the relevant clause. He read without asking questions, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. He didn't perform comprehension. He just comprehended. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The foundational patents are yours," he said. "Registered under your name personally, not the corporation's. The licensing agreement granted Min-jae's company royalty-free use of the platform and all derivative technologies for a period of 10 years, which expires on the 24th. He picked up one of the documents. "There's no automatic renewal clause. He'd have needed you to sign an extension. Has he ever approached you about that?" "No." She'd thought about this on the walk over. I think he assumed I would, or he forgot it was coming, or he didn't think it mattered because he assumed I'd always be beside him. Park Ji-hoon set the document down carefully. Any of those three possibilities creates a significant problem for his corporation starting on the 24th. I know. He looked at her steadily. Ms. Thompson, what is it you want to do here? She'd expected that question. She'd been turning it over since 3 in the morning, not as a legal question, but as a human one. What kind of person does this? What kind of person is willing to? What does it cost and who pays it? I want to know exactly what I own, she said. Before I decide anything else, I need to know the full picture. Assets, rights, exposure, everything. He nodded. That I can give you. Give me a week. I need it in 4 days. He didn't argue. He reached for his pen. She went back to the apartment and slept for 3 hours. When she woke up, there were 7 missed calls from Min Jae and a text that said, "Come home. We'll talk properly." She stared at the word home. He'd used it without thinking. The mansion, the one she'd helped design room by room, the one that was apparently now also Han Seo-ah's home. She put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. Her stomach was unsettled in the mornings now. She kept crackers on the nightstand and ate 3 before she got up. She moved carefully, the way you do when your body is doing something enormous and you're trying not to disrupt it. She showered. She dressed. She called her closest friend, a Korean-American woman named Dana, who'd worked in Seoul's tech sector for 8 years and who had, on several occasions, looked at Zuri's relationship with Min Jae the way you look at a beautiful building constructed on unstable ground. Dana answered on the second ring. "Tell me something good," Dana said by way of greeting. "He married someone else." Silence. "Yesterday morning," Zuri said. "Civil ceremony. He told me in the car after my dress fitting." More silence. Then, "I'm coming over." "You don't need to. I'm already putting on shoes. Do you have food?" "Don't answer. You definitely don't have food. I'm stopping at the market." She arrived 40 minutes later with groceries and the specific expression of a woman who had privately suspected something like this for years and was furious at herself for not saying so louder. She put the food away without being asked, made tea she knew Zuri wouldn't drink, and soup she knew she would, and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "The woman from the latte charity dinner," Dana said. It wasn't a question. Zuri looked at her. "Han Seo-ah. I saw them talking. He introduced her to me as a business contact. I thought..." Dana pressed her lips together. "I thought I was reading something that wasn't there. I told myself I was wrong." "You weren't wrong. Zuri..." "Don't." She said it without heat. "Don't apologize for not telling me something I wouldn't have believed." Dana was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." That was honest. She knew what she was starting to build. She could feel the architecture of it forming the same way she could feel the architecture of a software system, the load-bearing elements clarifying themselves from the background noise. But she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud would make it real and irreversible, and she was not quite there. "Are you okay?" Dana asked. Zuri thought about that. "I'm going to be," she said, which was a different answer, and they both knew it. On the 3rd day, Min Jae stopped calling and appeared instead. She heard the knock and knew it before she opened the door. She'd known the particular cadence of his knock for a decade. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand not quite on the doorknob, breathing, locating herself. She opened it. He looked tired. That surprised her slightly. She'd expected him composed because he was almost always composed, but there were marks under his eyes and a tension around his jaw that she recognized as the specific exhaustion of a man who had made a calculation he was no longer entirely confident in. He looked at her face. He looked at the apartment behind her. "Can I come in?" "No?" He absorbed that. "Zuri?" "Say what you need to say from there." He glanced down the hallway. Empty. He looked back at her. "This isn't what I wanted," he said. "Which part?" "Any of it going this way." He pushed a hand through his hair, a gesture she knew, one he made when he was genuinely uncomfortable rather than performing discomfort. Seoa's family applied pressure I didn't anticipate. The timing, Min Jae. She said his name flatly, not cruelly. "You signed a marriage certificate. You didn't do that accidentally." "The business implications for the family alliance if I refused." "Stop." She held up one hand. I don't want the business explanation. I want you to tell me, once, without any of the framing. Did you know, when you went to that ceremony, that you were going to tell me afterward? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Did you think, she continued, her voice staying level, that I would accept it? That I would hear you explain it in the car and understand and go back to the mansion and fit myself around the new arrangement? His jaw tightened. I thought you understood how these things work. I understand exactly how they work, she said. I've understood for 10 years. I want to know if you thought I would accept it. He looked at her directly. Yes, he said. I did. She nodded once, slowly. Okay. That's not... I meant it as a measure of how much I trust what we have. Not as... I said okay, Minjai. She started to close the door. He put his hand against it. Not forcefully. Just enough. His eyes were sharper now, the exhaustion folding back into something more familiar. Come back to the house. We'll handle this properly. Take your hand off my door. He held for 1 second. 2. Then he removed it. You have nowhere to put yourself that isn't connected to me, he said. It wasn't a threat. It was delivered the way he delivered most difficult truths, as simple fact, confident in its accuracy. Your work, your access, your position here, it all runs through what we built together. She looked at him for a moment, at the certainty in his face, the absolute practiced certainty. Good night, Minjai, she said. She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it and listened to the silence, and then the sound of him walking away. She went to the kitchen. She ate the rest of Dana's soup cold, standing at the counter, because she was tired and her feet ached, and she was 34 years old and pregnant, and she did not have the energy to perform devastation that she was no longer feeling. What she was feeling was something colder and more precise than grief. She pulled out her laptop and kept working. The charity gala was 4 days later, and she went because not going would have communicated something she wasn't ready for him to know yet. The Kong family's annual gala was the kind of event that operated on 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, a glossy fundraiser attended by politicians, CEOs, technology executives, and a careful cross-section of Seoul's social architecture. Underneath, a gathering of the actual power structure. The men who ran things, the alliances that needed maintaining, the relationships that required visible tending. Zuri had attended everyone for the past 7 years. She had organized 2 of them. She knew the caterers, the venue manager, the security rotation, and exactly which conversations happened in which corners of the room. She arrived in a dress she'd owned for 2 years, a deep burgundy that Minjae had once said made her look like she was daring the room to underestimate her. She'd worn it deliberately. What she had not been prepared for, had not fully prepared herself for, despite knowing intellectually that it was coming, was walking into that ballroom and seeing Han Seoa standing beside Minjae at the center of it. Seoa was 25 years old and extraordinarily beautiful in the specific way of women who have been told so repeatedly since childhood and have made peace with it as their primary currency. She was wearing a gown that Zuri recognized from a designer house in Cheongdam-dong, midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, with a train that required management. She was laughing at something one of Minjae's senior captains had said, and her laugh was practiced and perfect, and Minjae's hand was at the small of her back. Zuri walked through the entrance. She kept her face neutral. She accepted a glass of water from a passing tray. She was 8.5 weeks pregnant, and she was done pretending to drink champagne for the evening. And she began making her way through the room. She'd taken 4 steps when she felt it. The shift in the atmosphere, the particular quality of attention that a room generates when it is collectively watching something and pretending not to. The whispers didn't reach her ears directly. They didn't need to. She knew what they sounded like. She'd been in enough rooms to recognize the texture of people discussing something they found simultaneously awful and fascinating. The woman he replaced. A week before the wedding, standing right there, look. She kept walking. She smiled at Minjae's CFO and shook his hand and asked about his daughter's university application. She spoke to 2 board members about a cybersecurity conference she was ostensibly planning to attend. She moved through the room with the deliberate intention of making it impossible for anyone watching to conclude she was wounded, because she needed them to see her as exactly what she was, a woman who belonged here because of what she'd built, not because of who she was attached to. Minjae found her near the window, 20 minutes in. He came alone, without Seoa, which was a calculation she noticed and filed. You came, he said. I was invited. I wasn't sure you would. She looked at him without expression. Was Seoa told who organized the last two galas? Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. Min-jae didn't do guilt in the conventional sense, more like recalibration. Zuri. I'm going to speak to venue manager about the audio setup for the keynote. Excuse me. She moved past him. He didn't stop her. The evening progressed. She ate very little, which was easier to explain in a room where no one was watching carefully enough. She carried a champagne glass for 40 minutes without drinking from it, a skill she'd developed at events like this years ago when she was working and couldn't afford the blur of alcohol. She spoke to people who mattered. She listened to conversations that were useful. And then, around 9:30, she was standing near the corridor that led to the venue's service hallway, a route she knew well, had used dozens of times to coordinate with staff. And she heard Min-jae's voice carrying from around the corner. He was with three of his most trusted captains, the particular easy laughter that men produce when they believe they're unobserved. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The corridor carried sound efficiently, and she'd always had good hearing. Overreacting, one of the captains was saying. She'll be back within the week. And Min-jae's voice, easy and certain. She has nowhere else to land. Everything she is here, she built inside what I run. She knows that. A pause. Someone making a sound of agreement. Give her a few days, he continued. She'll come around. Zuri's smart enough to know which side of this works in her favor. She stood absolutely still. Her champagne glass was in her hand, and she was looking at a point on the wall across from her, and her chest was doing something she couldn't entirely name. Not devastation, she'd already moved past devastation, but something that settles differently, something that sits in the lower register and hardens. Nowhere else to land. She thought about Park Ji-hoon's office, the documents on the desk, the licensing agreement, the number she'd been slowly, quietly, doing in her head since the night in the apartment. She thought about the development logs she'd compiled over 10 years, the patent registrations, the source code archives she'd maintained on private servers under her personal encryption keys, servers that Min-jae's IT team didn't have access to because she'd built them before his team existed. She set the champagne glass on a nearby table. She straightened her dress. She walked back into the gala. The encounter with Seoa happened at 10:15 in the hallway outside the women's restroom. Zuri had come from inside. Seoa was waiting, not positioned, not staged, simply standing there with the particular restlessness of a young woman who was bored at an event she didn't yet know how to work. Up close, she was even younger looking than across the ballroom, with the kind of skin that doesn't require effort and eyes that had learned to calculate quickly. They looked at each other for a moment. Mrs. Kang, Zuri said, with perfect evenness. Something flickered across Seoa's face, not embarrassment, which Zuri might have respected, but a flash of something more territorial. I've been wanting to speak with you. Have you? Min-jae says you've been part of his life for a long time. She said it the way you'd describe a piece of furniture that predates the renovation. It must be difficult. I'm fine. Zuri moved a step past her. He told me about your arrangement. Seoa's voice was light, conversational, calibrated. He explained everything. I don't have any issue with what you were to him. That was before. Zuri stopped. She turned back. She looked at Seoa with the kind of attention she usually reserved for code that wasn't behaving correctly. Patient, diagnostic, not particularly emotional. What I was to him, she repeated. Seoa's chin lifted slightly. I think it would be easier for everyone if you found your own path forward. Min-jae is generous. He'll make sure you're taken care of. But this limbo isn't good for anyone. Zuri studied her face for a long moment. The confidence there. The complete architecturally sound confidence of someone who believed she was standing on solid ground because a man had given her a piece of paper. You're 25, Zuri said. I don't see what that has to do with... You've been in Min-jae's world for how long? 8 months? 9? Seoa's jaw tightened. I built the technology that runs everything he owns, Zuri said quietly. Not with heat. With the particular calm of a fact being stated. The AI surveillance platform, the financial routing system, the cybersecurity architecture. I wrote it, I own the patents. I have owned them for 10 years. Not him. Me." She paused. "Whatever arrangement you think you've married into, I'd spend some time this week learning what actually holds it together." Seoa's face had gone very still. "You're being—" What happened next moved fast. Seoa's hand came up. Not a full swing, just a sharp motion, and the flat of her palm connected with Zuri's cheek, hard enough to rotate her head sideways. The sound of it in the narrow hallway was loud and clean. Zuri's shoulder caught the wall as she pulled back, her heel skidding slightly on the marble floor, and she put her hand out to catch herself against a stone countertop that jutted from an alcove. The contact of her hip against the corner of it was sharp and bad. She felt it deep, a jolt that went through her side and down and made her breath go flat for a second. Seoa stumbled backward 2 steps, and then, in the 2 seconds between what had actually happened and what would be reported, Seoa grabbed the shoulder of her own gown and pulled. The fabric tore along a seam, a controlled tear, not an accident, and Zuri saw it happen with the detached clarity of someone experiencing 2 things simultaneously: the pain in her side spreading with each breath, and the understanding of exactly what was about to occur. The door at the end of the hallway opened. Minji came through it, which meant he'd been nearby, which meant someone had told him she and Seoa were in the same corridor, which meant the geography of this moment was not as accidental as it appeared. He took in the scene in the specific way that men who are trained to assess threats assess scenes. Seoa, with her torn dress, one hand at her torn shoulder, eyes already glassing over with the first performance of tears. Zuri with her hand against the counter, her cheek reddened, her posture slightly folded at the hip because the pain in her side was real and she couldn't entirely straighten. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a demand. Seoa's voice broke on cue. "She grabbed me, she tore my dress." "I didn't touch her," Zuri said. His eyes went to the torn dress, to Seoa's shoulder, to Zuri's face, which was still carrying the mark from the slap, which he apparently either didn't see or chose not to interrogate. "Zuri." His voice was hard. "I didn't touch her," she said again, and her voice was very steady despite the fact that the pain in her left side was now significant and her heart was doing something irregular in her chest that she didn't want to look at directly. He crossed the hallway in 4 steps and took Zuri by the arm. Not gently, the way you take someone by the arm when you're not thinking about whether you're hurting them, just applying grip. And the jolt of it against her already impacted hip made her breath hitch, and she pulled back instinctively and her back went into the counter again, harder this time. She made a sound she hadn't intended to make. He let go. He looked at his hand. He looked at her face, which had changed because pain has a way of changing faces, regardless of how much you want to control it. He turned and went to Seoa. He put his arm around her. He guided her away from the hallway, speaking quietly against her hair, his hand covering the torn section of her gown with the practiced protectiveness of a man who had already made his decision and was not going to revisit it. He did not look back at Zuri. She stood in the hallway for a moment, alone, her hand on the counter, her breath short. She looked down at herself. Burgundy dress. Her feet were solid on the marble. She took a breath, then another. The pain in her side was significant, and she was 8.5 weeks pregnant, and she needed to get to a hospital, and she was going to do that calmly and without telling anyone here why. She gathered herself and she walked out of the gala. Through a side door she'd used before, and she called Dana from the car and she said, "I need you to take me to the hospital. Don't ask me anything yet, just come." Dana came. The doctors were thorough and careful. The ultrasound showed a heartbeat that was fast and strong and completely undisturbed, and the doctor explained that the impact had been to her hip and lower back, and that everything that mattered was fine. And Zuri lay in that hospital bed listening to the heartbeat on the monitor and felt something in her chest that had been compressed for several days finally reach its breaking point. She didn't cry loudly. She just let her eyes go and stared at the ceiling while the monitor kept its rhythm, and Dana sat in the chair beside her and held her hand and had the grace to say absolutely nothing. When the room was quiet enough, Zuri spoke. "I need Park Ji-hoon to file the licensing claim before the 24th, she said. Her voice was rough, but her meaning was clear. All of it. The platform, the patents, the derivative systems. File for full commercial terms. No extensions, no grace period, no negotiation window on the existing royalty-free agreement." Dana looked at her. "Zuri..." I need it filed before he realizes what's coming. She turned her head and looked at Dana directly. Can you get me a phone? Dana got her the phone. She called Park Ji-hoon at 11:47 at night from a hospital bed where the monitor beside her was still tracking a heartbeat that nobody else in the world knew about yet. And she said, "Move the timeline up. File everything we have by the 22nd, 2 days early." Park Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. "Once I file," he said carefully, "there's no pulling it back." "I know," she said. "The corporation will have no legal right to operate the platform from the 24th. The financial systems, the surveillance infrastructure, the security architecture, all of it reverts to commercial licensing terms or goes dark." "I know what it means." Another pause. Then, "I'll have everything filed by end of day on the 22nd. She handed the phone back to Dana. She looked at the ceiling. The monitor kept its quiet, steady count. She thought about Min-jae walking away down that hallway with his arm around Seo-ah's torn dress, not looking back. She thought about what he'd said to his captains in the corridor. She has nowhere else to land. There is a particular moment in the architecture of any structure. A building, a system, a relationship, where the decision gets made. Not announced, not argued over, just made, quietly, in the place where the load-bearing elements either hold or they don't. She had reached that moment in the corridor of that gala, and she had felt the decision settle into her the way concrete settles, without drama, without ceremony, simply becoming the new floor she would build everything else on top of. She was not going back. She was discharged at 6:40 in the morning. Dana drove her back to the apartment in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, close enough that Zuri could have taken it if she'd needed to. She didn't take it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Seoul come alive through the passenger window. Delivery trucks, early commuters, a woman in a yellow coat walking a small dog along the Han River embankment, and she breathed steadily and thought about nothing she wasn't ready to think about. The apartment smelled like the soup Dana had made 3 days ago. Zuri changed her clothes, ate crackers standing at the kitchen counter, and opened her laptop before 8 a.m. She had 4 days until the 22nd. Park Ji-hoon had told her he'd have everything filed by end of day. She believed him. What she needed now was to understand the full architecture of what she was about to set in motion. Not just the legal mechanism, which she'd already mapped, but the financial one. Because the licensing claim would create a structural crisis for the corporation, and she needed to know exactly how that crisis would unfold before Min-jae's people did. She pulled up the financial models she'd built over the years, the internal routing maps, the revenue attribution by platform component, the subsidiary structure. She'd built access to most of this herself and never relinquished it. One of the ironies of being the person who designed the system was that you knew where all the doors were, including the ones nobody thought to lock because nobody thought you'd ever need to use them against the owner. She worked until noon. She ate something she barely tasted. She kept working. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Park Ji-hoon called. "I've been going through the subsidiary financials," he said, without greeting. The absence of greeting told her something. "There's something you need to see. Send it." "I'd rather show you in person." She was in his office by 3. He had the documents spread across the conference table when she arrived. Printed, not digital, which was another signal. Ji-hoon was a man who printed things when he wanted to be able to point to them, to make the evidence physical and unavoidable. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at what he'd laid out. It took her 60 seconds to understand what she was looking at. It took another 30 for her hands to go completely still at her sides. Seo-ah's company, a luxury brand consultancy called Haneul Image Group, registered 8 months ago, had received 47 separate payments from 3 of the Kang Corporation's subsidiaries over the past 7 months. The payments were categorized as marketing consultation fees. They were not small. She added them in her head without needing a calculator, because she'd always done arithmetic fast and under pressure she did it faster. $11.3 million, channeled through companies she'd helped build, through financial routing systems she'd designed, into an entity belonging to the woman Min-jae had married. She pulled out a chair and sat down, not because she was overwhelmed, because she needed to be seated to look at this properly, to give it the attention it required without her body doing anything unhelpful. "Who approved these payments?" she said. Park Ji-hoon's finger moved to a column on the 3rd document. "Each one carries an authorized signatory. 2 of the subsidiaries, Min Jae's direct signature. The third, he paused. Your name. She looked up at him. Forged, he said immediately. The signature doesn't match your archived samples from legitimate documents. I had a handwriting analyst look at it this morning. Whoever signed it studied your signature, but the pressure distribution is wrong and the terminal strokes are inconsistent. He hesitated. This is why I wanted to show you in person, because you needed to know before we filed. She looked back at the document. Her name. On a payment authorization sending $4.1 million into COA's company. Her name, which she had not put there. When was this signed, she said. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, she'd been designing the final tech architecture for the platform's next development phase, working 12-hour days, coming home to the mansion and eating dinner with Min Jae and discussing the gala seating plan. 6 weeks ago, she'd been measuring the distance between the bridal shop and the venue and deciding whether the shuttle service needed 2 buses or 3. She sat very still. If this surfaces before we file, she started, it could be used to argue that you were a willing participant in the financial irregularities, Ji-hoon said. He said it quickly and clearly, the way he said things he needed her to hear without the coding. It muddies your standing as a damaged party. It gives them a counter-narrative. It's forged. I know it's forged. Proving it is a process. Processes take time. Time is the one thing that works against you right now. She looked at the signature again, the careful, studied, almost right version of her handwriting. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had practiced. This wasn't improvised, she said. Ji-hoon shook his head. This was built as insurance. She was thinking out loud now, not for his benefit, but because she needed to hear the logic assembled. If I ever became a problem, if I ever moved against the corporation, they'd surface this. Make it look like I was part of the fun diversion. Neutralize me. That's my reading, Ji-hoon said. When was Hanul Image Group registered? 8 months ago. 8 months ago was 2 months before COA entered Min Jae's formal orbit, or at least before Zuri was aware of her, which meant the company had been created before the relationship was visible, which meant this wasn't reactive. This was designed. She put both palms flat on the table. She breathed once. Who else knows about this, she said. My analyst and myself. I haven't filed anything. I wanted your guidance first. She looked at the documents in the order he'd laid them out. Then she began rearranging them, resequencing by subsidiary rather than by date, building a different map of the same information. Pull the bank records for Hanul's receiving accounts, she said. All 7 months. I want to know where the money went after it landed, whether it stayed in the company accounts or moved again. That will take how long? 48 hours if I push my forensic contact. Push him. She stood up. She collected 3 of the documents, the ones with the forged signature, and folded them carefully and put them inside her bag. Make copies of everything before I leave. I want a full duplicate set in a location that isn't your office. Done. He was already reaching for the copier. Zuri? He used her first name, which he almost never did. She looked at him. This changes the complexity of what we're doing considerably. I know. They anticipated you moving. They prepared a defense before you made a move. I know that too. He held her gaze. Are you still sure you want to proceed? She thought about the hospital room, the monitor and its steady rhythm, the ceiling she'd stared at while she'd made the decision that was already made. File on the 22nd, she said. Nothing changes. She went back to the apartment and sat on the floor of the hallway. Not the couch, not a chair, just the floor with her back against the wall. Because sometimes the floor is the right height for what you're dealing with. She put her head back and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just learned without trying to immediately build something on top of it. Someone in Min Jae's circle had forged her signature, had spent time practicing her handwriting, and had produced a document that would take forensic analysis to conclusively disprove. Had done this months ago, before she'd made any move, before Min Jae had married Seoa, before any of this was visible to her. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Min Jae had planned this level of defensive architecture himself, which meant the man she'd spent 10 years beside was more deliberately calculating about her specific removal than she'd understood. Or someone close to him, someone with access to her documents, her signatures, her financial authorization history, had built this without his full knowledge, And Min-jae was himself partly in the dark about the trap that had been set. She didn't know which was worse. She sat on the floor for 20 minutes. Then she got up. She washed her face. She made tea. She actually drank this time, standing at the kitchen window, watching the street below. And she thought about who had access to her signature samples. The answer was, not many people. Her signature appeared on incorporation documents, licensing agreements, and corporate filings, all of which were handled through Min-jae's legal team, which meant the origin point was somewhere inside that team. She called Dana. "I need a favor," she said when Dana picked up. "And I need you not to ask me why yet." "Okay." Min-jae's lead corporate attorney, the one who handles the subsidiary filings, Kim Tae-won. "Do you still have a contact at the Bar Association's registration office?" A pause. "My friend Soo-jin works in the filing department. Why?" "I need to know if Kim Tae-won has registered any new client engagements in the last 8 months outside the Kang Corporation. Specifically, any engagement related to a company called Haneul Image Group." The silence on the line was the kind that meant Dana was connecting pieces she didn't have all of yet, but could feel the shape of. "I'll call Soo-jin tonight," she said. "Thank you." Tonight, Zuri said. "Tell me tonight." Dana called back at 9:44. "Kim Tae-won filed a private client engagement for Haneul Image Group 11 months ago," she said. 2 months before Seoa appeared anywhere near Min-jae's circle publicly. Zuri sat with that. He was her attorney before he was processing filings that carry Zuri Thompson's forged signature, Dana said, and her voice had gone flat in the way it went flat when she was angry and controlling it. "He was working both sides. He had access to my signature on every corporate document he processed for the last 6 years, Zuri said. "Yeah." "And Min-jae trusts him completely." "Yeah." She stood up and walked to the window. The city was dark and lit at the same time, the way Seoul always was at night. Never fully dark, never fully quiet. Always this particular layered brightness. "Does Min-jae know?" Dana asked. "I don't know." She meant it. "I genuinely don't know." "Does it matter? For what you're doing?" She thought about that. It mattered for one thing. It mattered for how she understood the last 10 years, for the accounting of what was deliberate and what was someone else's initiative that Min-jae had either sanctioned or been insulated from. It mattered for whether the man she'd loved was the architect of this particular betrayal or simply the beneficiary of it. But for what she was building? No, it didn't change the structure. "Not for the filing," she said. "Okay," Dana breathed. "Okay, what do you need me to do?" "Nothing yet. Sit on this until I tell you." The 22nd arrived gray and cold, the way Seoul gets in mid-October when the season turns without ceremony. Zuri was dressed by 7. She had coffee she made herself and ate crackers while she read through the filing documents Ji-hoon had sent over for final review. At 10:16 her phone rang, Min-jae. She looked at it for 2 rings. She answered. "Where are you?" he said. No greeting. "My apartment." "I need you to come in. Today. There's a board preparation meeting for the Nakamura deal, and you're the only one with the platform access codes the Japanese team needs to review." She registered the familiarity of it, the way he dropped back into operational mode, the way 10 years of working together made him reach for her the moment there was a technical problem, the way he still believed, apparently, that they existed in a functional arrangement she had accepted. "I won't be at the board meeting," she said. A pause. "Zuri, this is a $40 million transaction. I need those codes." "You'll need to find another solution." Another pause. Longer. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, flattened slightly, the register dropping. "What does that mean?" "It means I won't be at the board meeting." "Are you—" He stopped. She could hear him thinking, recalibrating. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to have breakfast," she said. "Have a good morning, Min-jae." She ended the call. She set the phone down. Her hands were steady, and her coffee was going cold, and she picked it up and drank the rest of it anyway. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Park Ji-hoon called. "It's filed," he said. "All of it?" "Platform licensing claim, patent ownership reassertion, formal notice to the corporation that the royalty-free agreement concludes on the 24th. They've been served through their registered legal address." A pause. Kim Tae-won signed the receipt. The irony of that was almost beautiful. She didn't say so. How long before they understand what it means, she asked. Their financial team will figure it out within hours. The platform is embedded in every revenue-generating operation they run. The moment the license expires without renewal, they're operating in breach, he paused. Zuri. Once they understand the scope, and they will understand it quickly, the response is going to be significant. You need to be prepared for pressure, personal pressure, not just legal. I know what he's capable of, she said. I need to know you've thought about your physical safety. She had. She'd been thinking about it since the hospital. I have somewhere to go that he doesn't know about. I'll move tonight. Good. She started packing 30 minutes later. She was methodical. Documents first, then hard drives, then clothing. She didn't take anything she'd bought inside the mansion, didn't take anything that had been a gift. She took what was hers from before and what she'd accumulated independently, and she fitted into 2 bags with the efficient calm of someone who had mentally packed this bag many times before and was simply finally doing it. Dana arrived at 6 with her car. They loaded the bags. Zuri took one last look at the apartment, the one Min Jae had paid the lease on, the one she'd kept as an option she'd never quite committed to needing. She turned off the lamp. She left the key on the kitchen counter. They drove to a serviced apartment Dana had booked under her own name, in a building in Mapo that had no connection to anyone in Min Jae's world. On the way, Zuri's phone rang 4 times. Min Jae. She didn't answer. At the 5th call, she turned the phone off. She had a second phone, a number she'd activated 2 weeks ago and given only to Ji-hoon and Dana. She turned that one on. They brought the bags upstairs. Dana ordered food neither of them was hungry for. Zuri sat at the small desk by the window and opened her laptop and pulled up the forensic analysis Ji-hoon's contact had sent through earlier in the day, the bank records for Haneul Image Group. She looked at them for a long time. The money hadn't stayed in Haneul's accounts. Most of it had moved, in tranches through 2 intermediary accounts, into a personal account registered to Han Seo-ah in Singapore. But 3 tranches, totaling just under $2 million, had moved somewhere else. To an account she didn't immediately recognize, under a corporate name she had to search to identify. She searched it. The account belonged to a holding company called Jongdo Capital. She'd never heard the name. She spent 20 minutes tracing the registration documents before she found the beneficial owner listed in the filing. She sat back in her chair. Dana looked up from the couch. What? Zuri turned the laptop around. Dana leaned forward and read the screen. Her expression shifted through several things in quick succession: confusion, comprehension, and then something that wasn't quite anger, more like the look you get when something you suspected but couldn't prove finally proves itself. The beneficial owner of Jongdo Capital was not Seo-ah. It was not Kim Tae-won. It was not anyone from Seo-ah's family structure or social circle. It was a man named Kang Sung-woo, Min Jae's younger brother. Dana said quietly and with great care, "Oh." Zuri looked at the screen. She looked at the name. She thought about Min Jae's brother, 30 years old, ostensibly removed from the family operation, ostensibly building his own separate business interests. A man Min Jae trusted in the specific and unconditional way that people trust family when they have decided to trust family and will not revisit the decision. She thought about the scope of what she was now looking at. Not a woman who'd married her fiancé for status, not a corporate attorney running a side arrangement for a wealthy client. A financial extraction operation, methodical, multi-layered, running for at least 8 months, with a forged signature designed to neutralize her if she moved, and a beneficiary structure that reached inside Min Jae's own family. She thought about whether Min Jae knew about his brother's involvement, and then she thought about something more unsettling, whether it mattered, because if Sung-woo had built this without Min Jae's knowledge, then the empire that Min Jae had spent his life constructing had been quietly hollowed from the inside by someone he'd never thought to watch. And if Sung-woo had built this with Min Jae's knowledge, if the forged signature, the insurance trap, the financial routing had all been sanctioned, then the man she'd loved for 10 years was something more calculated than she'd understood. Either way, the ground beneath all of it had just dropped. She pulled the laptop back. She opened a new document. She began a list: assets, account numbers, transaction dates, beneficial owners, authorization trails. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, compiling the architecture of what she'd found into something that could be handed to a forensic accountant and understood completely. At 11:30, she stopped writing. She looked at the list. She looked at the name at the bottom of the financial trail. She thought about the board meeting Min-jae had called her about that morning, the $40 million Nakamura transaction, the platform access codes he'd needed from her and couldn't get because she hadn't come. She thought about how, in approximately 14 hours, the corporation's financial team would have fully grasped what the licensing claim meant, that the platform they'd built their entire technological infrastructure on was no longer legally available to them without her authorization, that every system running on it was in breach, that the Nakamura deal and every other pending transaction was sitting on ground that had just been pulled. She thought about Kang Sung-woo's name on that document. She closed the laptop. She looked at Dana, who had fallen asleep on the couch with her coat still on, exhausted by the specific tiredness of someone who's been holding someone else together for several days. Zuri got up quietly. She put a blanket over Dana. She went to the window and looked out at Mappo at midnight. The Han River visible in the distance, the lights of the bridges, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care about any of this. She put her hand on her stomach, briefly. Just a moment. She thought, the woman who walked into that bridal shop 3 weeks ago is not who stands here now, and she is not going back to being her, and she is not going to let the people who thought they'd accounted for every variable discover too late that they forgot to account for the one thing that actually mattered, that she had built everything they were standing on, and she understood its architecture better than any of them, and she knew exactly which wall to remove. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the city. She did not sleep immediately, but when she did, she slept without dreaming, which was the first time in 3 weeks that her body had allowed her that particular mercy, and she took it. The filing was already in, the clock was already running. And somewhere across the city, in a corporation built on her work and her silence and her decade of choosing to stay, the first cracks were beginning to show in walls that had been erected so confidently that no one inside them had thought to check the foundation. The call came at 6:43 in the morning, not from Min-jae, from his CFO, a man named Hwang Byung-soo, who had worked inside the corporation for 11 years and who had, in Zuri's experience, the specific emotional range of a man who dealt with crises by becoming very quiet and very precise. He was neither quiet nor precise when she answered. The platform is throwing access denials across the entire network, he said, and she could hear the controlled panic underneath the professional register, the way a building sounds before it starts to crack. Every subsidiary system, every routing interface, everything that runs on your architecture is returning unauthorized access flags as of midnight. She was already sitting up. She'd been half awake since 5. I'm aware, she said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for him to understand what that meant. Ms. Thompson, his voice had dropped. Please tell me this is a technical error. It's not a technical error. The silence on the line was the kind that precedes a significant change in the weather. The licensing agreement expired, she said. As of midnight on the 24th, the corporation no longer holds a valid license to operate any system built on my platform architecture. Your legal team was served formal notice on the 22nd, 2 days ago. No one informed me. That's a conversation you should have with Kim Tae-won, she said. He received the notice. Another pause, longer this time. She could almost hear him running the calculations, 11 years of knowing how this corporation operated and how long it would take the man at the top to hear what she'd just told him. He's going to call you, Hwang said. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, the way someone warns you about weather. I know, she said. She ended the call. She got up. She went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth and looked at her face in the mirror for a moment. She looked like someone who hadn't slept enough and had been carrying significant weight for 3 weeks, which was accurate. She splashed cold water on her face. She ate crackers. She made tea. Minji called at 7:12. She let it ring. It rang 8 times and went to voicemail. She watched the screen. 30 seconds later, it rang again. She let that one ring too. On the 3rd call, she answered, "You shut down the platform." His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was compressed, the way pressure compresses things, all the force contained rather than released. She'd heard that voice before. It was the voice he used when he was deciding how to respond to something serious, when he was still in the assessment phase. The license expired, she said. I didn't shut anything down. The agreement simply concluded. Zuri. One word, her name, carrying everything he wasn't saying. There are 47 pending transactions in the Nakamura pipeline alone that are now in breach, he said. The Tokyo partners have already been on the phone. The Hanseong contracts, everything that runs through the financial routing system. I know what runs through it, she said. I designed it. Fix it. The compression in his voice cracked slightly, not loudly, just the beginning of a fracture. Whatever this is, whatever you're doing, fix the access and we'll talk. Come to the office. Today. We'll talk. I won't be fixing the access, she said. If the corporation wants to continue operating any system on my platform architecture, it will need to negotiate a commercial licensing agreement. Park Ji-hoon has the terms ready. They're fair. The silence after that was different from the earlier silences. It had a specific quality, the quality of a man who has been operating inside a certainty for a long time and has just felt that certainty without warning. You're not serious, he said. I'm completely serious. This would destroy... He stopped. She could hear him breathing. You would take down everything we built together to make a point? It's not a point, she said. It's a business arrangement. The previous arrangement ended. A new one is available. That's how licensing works. She paused. You know that, Min-jae. You've structured enough of them yourself. Don't. His voice sharpened. Don't do this the way you do the technical things. This isn't code. This is everything. I know what it is. I will come to wherever you are, he said. And the compression had entirely given way now, and what was underneath it was something raw that she recognized from a handful of moments over 10 years, the moments when the armor came off not by choice. Tell me where you are. Let me come. We'll contact Park Ji-hoon about the licensing terms, she said. Have a good morning. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the desk. Her hand was shaking very slightly, which she observed without judgment, and then waited for it to stop. It took about 40 seconds. By 9 a.m., Ji-hoon had forwarded her 3 communications from the corporation's legal team, all variations of the same urgent demand for an emergency meeting. By 10, the banks that held financing for the Nakamura deal had been notified by the corporation's own partners that the platform architecture underlying the deal was in a licensing dispute. Huang had clearly been working the phones. By 10:45, one of the Japanese partners had formally suspended the deal pending resolution. She tracked all of this from the desk in the Mapo apartment, running on tea and crackers and the specific focused energy that comes from doing the thing you spent 3 weeks deciding to do. Dana was across the room on her own laptop, managing the documentation that Ji-hoon kept sending through, organizing it with the systematic competence of someone who had been underutilized in her actual career and was applying that excess capacity to something that mattered. At 11:30, Ji-hoon called. The board has called an emergency meeting, he said. Today at 3. They want you there. As what? As the licensing rights holder. They want to negotiate in person rather than through counsel. He paused. I'd recommend attending. If you don't show, they'll spend the next 6 hours deciding on their legal strategy without your voice in the room, and they'll build a position designed to discredit your ownership claim. They're going to try that anyway. Yes, but it's harder to do it while you're sitting across the table from them. Another pause. I've also heard from 2 board members independently who are not aligned with Min-jae on this. They've been watching the financial irregularities that you're filing forced into the open. They want to hear from you directly. She thought about that. Who? He gave her 2 names. She knew both of them. Older men, establishment figures who'd been on the board since before the corporation went public, men who had tolerated Min-jae's operational style because it produced returns, and who would not tolerate it if it produced liability. I'll be there, she said. Have everything ready. The source code documentation, the development logs, the patent registrations, and the forensic accounting on the annual payments. Already prepared. One more thing. She told him about Jongdo Capital, about Kang Sung-woo's name at the bottom of the financial trail. She heard him go very still on the other end of the line. How confident are you in that attribution? He said. The beneficial ownership registration is a public filing, she said. Pull it yourself. It takes 4 minutes. A pause. She could hear him pulling it, then, That changes things considerably. Bring it to the meeting, she said. Don't lead with it. Save it. She arrived at the corporation's headquarters at 2:50. The building was one she knew intimately. She'd consulted on its security architecture, had spent hundreds of hours inside it, knew which elevator bank was fastest and where the conference rooms with the worst acoustics were. She walked through the lobby wearing a charcoal suit she'd bought 2 years ago and worn exactly once, because it fit the way clothes fit when you want to be read as someone who has not come to negotiate but to conclude. Park Ji-hoon met her at the elevator. He had a leather folder and the expression of a man who had prepared as thoroughly as a man can prepare and was aware that preparation only accounts for part of what happens in rooms like this. They went to the 14th floor. The conference room was large, floor-to-ceiling glass on one side overlooking the city, a long table that sat 20, currently occupied by 11 people. She identified them in the seconds it took to walk from the door to her chair. 3 board members, 2 outside counsel, the CFO, the head of corporate development, 2 representatives from the Japanese partner firm, and Kim Tae-won, seated near the far end of the table, with his hands folded and his face arranged in professional neutrality. Min-jae was not there yet. She sat. Ji-hoon sat beside her. She placed her folder on the table and did not open it. She looked at the room with the steady attention she brought to problems she was going to solve. The older of the 2 board members she'd spoken to, a man named Director Choi, 71 years old, who had a reputation for patience she'd always respected, cleared his throat. "Ms. Thompson, thank you for coming." "Of course," she said. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn. Min-jae sat down across from her. She looked at him then. He looked like he'd aged something in the hours since they'd spoken. Not dramatically. He was still contained, still assembled, still dressed, with the precision of a man who understood that appearance carries authority. But there were marks under his eyes deeper than the ones she'd seen at her apartment door, and his jaw carried a tension that hadn't released, and the way he looked at her across that table had something in it she hadn't seen there before. He looked at her like she was someone he didn't entirely recognize, which she supposed was accurate. "Let's begin," Director Choi said. The corporation's outside counsel, a woman named Attorney Baek, who was sharp and well-prepared and clearly had not slept either, opened with a position that Zuri had anticipated. The licensing agreement, she argued, was subject to an implied renewal clause based on the parties' conduct over 10 years, and the sudden non-renewal constituted bad faith termination. Ji-hoon disassembled that argument methodically and without particular emotion, citing the agreement's explicit language, the absence of any renewal clause, and the documented delivery of formal notice 60 hours prior to expiration. Then Attorney Baek moved to her second position, that Zuri's role in the development of the platform had been collaborative rather than sole, and that significant intellectual contribution from the corporation's employees and resources over 10 years established joint ownership claims. Zuri opened her folder. She laid the documents on the table in sequence. Original development logs predating the corporation's involvement, early prototype registrations, the patent filings made under her name before the licensing agreement was signed, the source code commit history from the first 3 years of development showing her as sole contributor. She laid them out without commentary, without performance, just placed them in front of the people across the table, the way you place evidence in front of people who need to understand something. The foundational architecture was completed before the licensing agreement was executed, she said. Every patent registered in the first 3 years carries my name exclusively. The agreement itself acknowledges this. It describes the technology as Ms. Thompson's proprietary platform in the first clause. She paused. "Attorney Beck, do you have the agreement?" Beck had it. She looked at the first clause. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly. "The collaborative development argument would apply to derivative features built after year 3, Zuri continued. Those derivatives are explicitly covered under the licensing terms. The licensing terms, which have now expired." Director Choi looked at the documents. He looked at them carefully, the way men who have seen a lot of documents look at them when they understand what they're reading. The second board member, Director Yoon, 68, who had said very little, was doing the same. Min-jae had not spoken yet. He was watching her across the table with the compressed attention of a man solving a problem in real time that he hadn't expected to need to solve. Then Attorney Baek introduced the forged document. She slid it across the table. A copy, not the original, but identical in content. Zuri's name on the payment authorization, the signature that wasn't hers. This document, Beck said, establishes that Ms. Thompson was a willing participant in the corporate treasury transactions she's now characterizing as fraudulent. Her signature authorizes the transfer. If she's now claiming these transfers constitute misconduct, she's implicating herself. The room got quieter. The Japanese representatives exchanged a look. Huang looked at his hands. Zuri looked at the document. Then she looked at Kim Tae-won. He was the only person in the room looking directly back at her. His expression had not changed from its professional neutrality. But his hands, she noticed his hands, were no longer folded. They were flat on the table. And flat hands on a table, when a person is trying to project calm, mean the opposite of calm. That signature is forged, she said. We'd need expert verification to— I've already had it verified, Ji-hoon said. He opened his folder and placed the handwriting analyst's report on the table. Pressure distribution inconsistencies across the signature strokes, terminal stroke patterns, incompatible with Ms. Thompson's authenticated samples. The conclusion is definitive. Beck picked up the report. She read it. She set it down. Furthermore, Ji-hoon continued, we've traced the authorization chain for this document to its preparation source. He looked not at Beck, but at Kim Tae-won. The document was prepared using a formatting template identical to those used in Kim Tae-won's office. The metadata on the original digital file, which we obtained through a separate channel, lists the creating application's registered user as a workstation registered to this firm. The room was very quiet now. Kim Tae-won said, Don't, Ji-hoon said, and his voice was not loud but had a quality to it that stopped the word. I'd recommend not completing that sentence without your own counsel present. Min-jae was looking at Kim Tae-won. She watched it happen. The turn of his head, the focusing of his attention on the man who'd sat 3 chairs down from him at 100 meetings and handled his most sensitive legal work for 6 years. She watched Min-jae's face do something she'd rarely seen it do. It lost its arrangement, just briefly. Just the moment between one state and the next, before the muscles reimposed control. He looked at Kim Tae-won and something passed across his face that she didn't have a word for. Not quite betrayal, because betrayal requires surprise, and she couldn't tell how surprised he actually was, and that uncertainty was its own answer. Ms. Thompson, Director Choi said. His voice had changed register. He was no longer running a negotiation. He was running something else. Is there additional documentation relevant to the board's understanding of the financial irregularities? She looked at Director Choi. She held for one beat. Then she reached into her folder and removed the forensic accounting summary, the Hanul payment trail, the intermediary accounts, the Singapore deposits, the Jongdo capital transfers. She placed it on the table. $11.3 million was routed from 3 subsidiaries into Hanul Image Group over 7 months, she said. The routing used financial infrastructure I designed. The payments were categorized as marketing consultation fees. No corresponding services were delivered. She paused. The majority of those funds moved into a personal account registered to Han Seo Ah in Singapore. A portion, approximately $2 million, moved to a holding company called Jongdo Capital. She placed the Jongdo Capital registration on the table. The beneficial owner of Jongdo Capital, she said, is Kang Sung-woo. The name landed in the room the way heavy things land, with an impact that radiates outward. Min-jae's head turned. He looked at the document. He looked at it with the specific stillness of a man who has been hit somewhere unexpected and is waiting to determine the full extent of the damage before he moves. Director Yoon said very quietly, Sung-woo. Min-jae said nothing. Director Choi looked at the room. He looked at Min-jae. His face had gone to the particular professional seriousness of a man about to say something institutional. The board will need to convene privately, he said. Ms. Thompson, Attorney Park, if you could give us 40 minutes. She waited in a smaller conference room down the hall with a cup of water she didn't drink and Ji-hoon beside her making quiet notes. She could hear nothing from the main room. She didn't try to. 40 minutes became 70. Ji-hoon's phone buzzed twice. She looked at the ceiling. Her phone, the secondary one, buzzed with a text from Dana. Sung-woo's attorneys just showed up at the building lobby. Building security stopped them. 3 of them. She typed back, "Don't let anyone know where I'm staying." The door opened at 4:53. Director Choi stood in the frame. He looked tired in the way that meetings that required people to make significant decisions made people tired. "The board has reached a preliminary position," he said. "We'd like to discuss it with you." She went back in. Min-jae was still at the table. He was sitting differently, slightly back from it, one arm resting on the armrest of the chair, a posture that looked relaxed but wasn't. Kim Tae-won was gone. Beck was still there, but she was not looking at Zuri. She was looking at her own notes with the expression of a woman reorganizing her legal position. Director Choi sat. He folded his hands. "The board accepts that the licensing agreement has expired and that the corporation requires a new arrangement with Ms. Thompson to continue operations," he said. "We're prepared to move forward with commercial licensing negotiations under terms submitted by Attorney Park." She nodded once. "The board also accepts the forensic accounting evidence as grounds for an immediate internal investigation into the Haneul transactions and the Jongdo capital transfers." He looked at Min-jae briefly. "Effective immediately, executive authority over the corporation is suspended pending investigation. Professional management will be appointed by end of day." Min-jae said nothing. His jaw was set and his eyes were on the table in front of him, and the silence coming off him was enormous. "Furthermore," Choi continued, "the board requests that Ms. Thompson consider accepting a supervisory role during the transition period, given her foundational knowledge of the platform and corporate systems." She looked at Director Choi. She looked at the room. She looked finally at Min-jae. I was looking at her now. He'd lifted his eyes from the table and was looking directly at her, and his face was open in a way she'd seen only a few times in 10 years. Stripped of the layers, carrying something real. "You didn't have to take all of it," he said. His voice was quiet, flat. "You could have just left." "I tried to just leave," she said. "You told me I had nowhere else to land." He absorbed that. His throat moved. "I was wrong," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say, and she'd stopped filling silences with words that weren't useful some time ago. She looked back at Director Choi. "I'll accept the supervisory role on a temporary basis, 60 days, with a defined scope that Park Ji-hoon will specify." She paused. "The licensing negotiation needs to be completed within 10 days. After that, any system still running without authorization gets shut down." Director Choi nodded. "Understood." She picked up her folder. She stood. Min-jae stood up too. He did it quickly, the chair sliding back, and she stopped without turning around because she could feel the quality of his attention at her back, the way you feel temperature change. "Zuri." His voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could hear the roughness in it. "I need to ask you something." She turned. He was 3 feet away, standing with his hands at his sides, without the armor of the board meeting, without the structure of the argument, just him, which was something she hadn't seen clearly in a long time. "Is there something I should know?" he said. "About you. Something you haven't told me." The room was technically occupied by other people. Ji-hoon, Choi, Yoon, Baek, but they had all found reasons to be looking somewhere else, with the trained discretion of people who understood they were witnessing something outside the scope of the meeting. She looked at Min-jae's face. She thought about the ultrasound image in her bag. She thought about the hospital room and the monitor and the decision she'd made there about what that information meant and who it served and when she would deploy it. "You lost the right to know my private matters," she said, "on the day you decided your certainty about me was more important than my dignity." He went very still. "When I'm ready," she said, "I'll tell you what you need to know, not before." She walked to the door. Ji-hoon fell in beside her. She pushed the door open and walked out into the corridor, and the door swung shut behind her with a sound that was completely ordinary. Just a door, just hinges and air, but which felt, in the specific texture of that moment, like the closing of something that had been open for a very long time. The next 4 days were the kind of work she'd always been best at. Complex, multi-threaded, requiring simultaneous attention to legal architecture, financial systems, and human dynamics without letting any one of them collapse while she was focused on the others. The licensing negotiation ran in parallel with the forensic investigation. Ji-hoon's team and the board's appointed investigators worked separately but with overlapping documentation, and she sat in on 3 sessions where the financial routing was traced transaction by transaction, watching investigators who were very good at their jobs build the evidentiary structure she'd already built in the Mapo apartment at midnight. Kim Tae-won retained his own counsel and said nothing useful. He would eventually say several things through his attorney that amounted to negotiating reduced exposure in exchange for cooperation, but that process was beginning rather than concluding. Kang Sung-woo's attorneys, after the failed lobby appearance, issued 2 formal statements denying beneficial ownership of Jongdo Capital, both of which collapsed immediately against the public filing, which is what happens when you rely on a defense that requires other people to not know how to read public documents. Han Seo-ah retained a public relations firm and gave an interview to a major entertainment media outlet in which she characterized herself as a young woman who had been manipulated by powerful people and was seeking justice for her own exploitation. The interview was well produced and she was compelling in it, young and beautiful and precisely calibrated in her distress. And for approximately 48 hours, the public narrative tilted in her direction. Then Zuri released the security footage. Not all of it. Just the hallway footage from the gala? 6 minutes and 40 seconds of footage from a security camera she'd known about because she'd specified its placement herself when she consulted on the venue's security layout 2 years earlier. The footage showed the entire encounter, Seo-ah waiting, the conversation, the slap, the deliberate tear of the dress, and most decisively, the 2-second window between the tear and Min Jae's arrival through the door, during which Seo-ah could be clearly seen glancing toward that door. She had known he was coming. She had staged the damage before he arrived. Zuri released the footage through Ji-hoon's office, accompanied by the medical report from the hospital documenting her injuries that night, and a statement that was 7 sentences long and contained no editorial commentary on Seo-ah as a person, only facts, in sequence, with documentation attached to each one. The public conversation turned within hours. Sponsors announced they were reviewing their relationships with Haneul Image Group, a fashion house that had featured Seo-ah in its Seoul campaign, quietly removed the campaign materials from its website without announcement. Investigators, who had already been notified through proper channels, issued a formal statement confirming an active financial inquiry. On the evening of what would have been Zuri and Min Jae's wedding day, she sat in the Mapo apartment with Dana and ate takeout from a restaurant. Dana had found that made a kimchi jjigae that was better than anything Zuri had eaten in months, and they watched the city lights through the window without the television on, without her phone making noise, without anything requiring immediate attention. Dana said, "How are you actually doing?" Zuri thought about that. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, briefly, a gesture that had become reflexive in the last 3 weeks. "I'm okay," she said. And then, because Dana deserved more than that, "I'm tired. I'm scared of some things I won't say out loud yet, and I'm—" She stopped, found the word. "Clearer than I've been in a long time." Dana looked at her. "Clearer. About what I'm building. About who I am when I'm not building it for someone else." She picked up her food again. "It feels different. The work. When you know it's yours." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's happening with the company launch?" Zuri had been thinking about this for days, not in the background, but in the foreground, in the space that had opened up now that the defensive architecture was largely in place and the offensive work was running on its own momentum. "The venue that was booked for the wedding," she said. "I spoke to the event manager this morning. The date is still available. The room is still configured." Dana looked at her. "I want to launch Obsidian Nexus on that date," Zuri said. "In that room. With the guest list reconfigured, not family and friends, but investors, board candidates, technology partners, international security firms. I've already been in conversation with." She met Dana's eyes. "I want to use the day he turned into a loss and make it into something I built." Dana stared at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her chopsticks and pointed them at Zuri. "I will handle every logistical detail," she said, "if you let me have a title when the company is real." Zuri looked at her. "Head of operations," she said. Dana pointed the chopsticks at her again. "Done." They sat in the window light and ate their food while the city moved below them, and Zuri felt something she hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Not happiness, which was too simple, but something more structural than that, the feeling of a foundation that had been poured and was setting correctly, solid in the places that mattered. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. "Ji-hoon." Min Jae has asked to meet with you privately before the launch event. He says it's personal, not legal. Your call. She looked at the message for a moment. She looked at the city. She put the phone face down on the table. That was a decision for tomorrow. Tonight she had kimchi jjigae and city lights and the particular satisfaction of someone who had built something from nothing before and knew they were about to do it again, and understood in her marrow that the most dangerous version of herself was not the version that fought back. It was the version that knew exactly what she was worth and was done pretending otherwise for the comfort of people who needed her smaller than she actually was. She picked up her food. She ate. And across the city, in a corporation that ran on her architecture and was only now beginning to understand what that meant, the systems she had built kept running, not for him anymore, not under the old terms, not in the arrangement that had held for 10 years, but under new terms, her terms, the terms of a woman who had spent a decade building the floor beneath someone else's feet and had finally, completely, and without apology, decided it was time to build her own. She answered Ji-hoon's text the next morning at 7:43, sitting at the desk in the Mapo apartment with tea going cold beside her laptop and the city still gray outside the window. Tell him Thursday, neutral location, my choice. 1 hour. Ji-hoon responded within 4 minutes. He agreed immediately. Where? She thought about it longer than the question required. She thought about every location she associated with Min Jae. The mansion, the restaurants where he conducted business over dinner, the hotel lobbies where she'd waited while he finished meetings that ran long, the corporate building she'd just walked out of 2 days ago. Every location inside his world. Every location that had been partly hers and was now something she couldn't enter without it costing her something. She thought about a small cafe in Yongsan she'd found 3 years ago on a Sunday afternoon when Min Jae had a meeting that consumed the weekend, and she'd needed to move her body through the city without direction, without purpose, without being anyone's anything for a few hours. She'd sat there for 2 hours with a book she'd barely opened, and drunk tea and watched Yongsan go about its business, and she'd felt, briefly, cleanly, like a person who existed independently of any other person's story. She'd never taken him there. He'd never known about it. Cafe in Yongsan, she typed, and gave Ji-hoon the address. Thursday at 10, I arrive first. The days between were full in the way that doing real work fills days, completely, without ceremony, without space for the kind of thinking that circles back on itself and finds nothing new. She worked on the licensing framework revisions with Ji-hoon on Monday morning, 2 hours at his office table with printed documents and a coffee she actually finished. And when they were done, she felt the particular satisfaction of something being exactly as it should be, no more and no less. The Obsidian Nexus launch preparations were consuming Dana in the best possible way. Dana had taken the operational scope Zuri had outlined and built something more detailed and more functional than Zuri had designed alone, because Dana's particular organizational intelligence, the kind that maps dependencies and anticipates friction before it occurs, was exactly the complement to Zuri's own, and she understood now why the previous 8 years of their friendship had always felt like the edges of something larger than what either of them had been doing. She reviewed the product deck on Tuesday evening and revised 4 slides herself. Not because the design was wrong, but because 2 technical claims were slightly understated, softer than the reality. And she was done softening what was actually true in order to not seem like she was claiming too much. She knew exactly what she'd built. She was going to say so directly. Wednesday, she spent 3 hours with the forensic investigators in a room that smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, going through the Hanuel transaction trail in the precise and patient way that forensic accounting requires. They asked exact questions, and she gave exact answers, and she did not look past the questions toward outcomes, because the outcomes would be what they were, and her job here was the facts in sequence. She'd been doing that for weeks now, and she'd gotten better at it, the discipline of staying inside the evidence and not running ahead of it. Wednesday evening, alone, she took the ultrasound image from her bag. She'd been carrying it since the beginning. The same copy, creased now at the corner from being taken in and out. She was 13 weeks. She'd had a follow-up appointment on Monday, and the doctor had been careful and warm in the way that doctors are careful and warm when they understand the full picture and want to indicate without saying it directly that they see it. She put the image on the desk. She looked at it for a long time under the lamp. The small gray shape. The record of a heartbeat she'd heard twice now on a monitor in 2 different rooms, both times alone, and each time she'd sat with the sound of it and let it be what it was. The most uncomplicated fact in the entire complicated structure of the past several weeks. A heartbeat. Fast and regular and entirely its own. She took out a second copy she'd had printed specifically for Thursday and put it in a small envelope. She put the envelope in her bag. She went to bed. She slept 9 hours, which was the second time in the past month she'd slept 9 hours, and she noted this the way you note a sign of returning normalcy. Not with drama, just with the quiet acknowledgement that the body is starting to trust again, that rest is allowed. Thursday morning, she dressed without deliberation. Dark jeans, a cream sweater she'd owned since Chicago, flat boots she'd bought the first year she was in Seoul, when she'd realized that heels were incompatible with the amount of walking she did, and had stopped wearing them without announcing it to anyone. Small gold earrings she'd bought herself when she was 23, before Seoul, before any of this. The kind of purchase you make when you're young and broke and want one thing that is entirely yours and costs you exactly what you decided it was worth. She took the subway to Yongsan. She walked the last 6 blocks through the autumn cold, hands in her pockets, watching the neighborhood move through its Thursday morning. A school group cutting across an intersection, a woman unloading flowers from a van outside a small shop, 2 men from a construction company drinking coffee on the tailgate of a truck. The ordinary machinery of a city that neither knew nor cared about any of the things she was carrying. She arrived at the cafe 8 minutes early. She ordered tea at the counter, found a table against the wall with sightlines to the door, and sat with her back straight and her hands around the cup and waited. Min Jae arrived at 10 exactly. He came through the door without looking around first, found her immediately with the directness of someone who'd been thinking about this specific moment long enough to have visualized it, and crossed the room without stopping, without adjusting his coat, without the usual layered procedural approach of a man who manages his entrances. He just came to the table and sat down. He looked tired. Not the way he'd looked at her apartment door when he'd been pretending the exhaustion was less than it was. Genuinely tired, the kind that settles into the face over weeks and becomes structural rather than incidental. He'd shaved that morning. His eyes were clear. I was wearing a dark coat she recognized, which she noticed and then set aside. He put his hands on the table. He didn't order anything. He looked at her face with the directness of a man who had decided he was going to look at things directly from here forward, whether or not it helped him. "Thank you for this," he said. "You asked. I had an hour." He absorbed that. His jaw shifted slightly. Not defensively, more like someone recalibrating the terms of the conversation before it begins. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you respond." She waited. The cafe moved quietly around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, a chair scraping, low voices from the table near the window. "I didn't know about Sungwoo." He said it without preamble, without the scaffolding of a prepared speech, just the sentence placed on the table between them. The whole structure, Haneul, the Jongdo Capital account, the forged signature, Kim Tae-won working both sides. None of it had my knowledge or sanction. I want to be clear about that. Not because it changes what you're doing or should change anything about what you've built, but because you've been walking around for weeks believing the man you spent 10 years beside was capable of specifically engineering your destruction if you ever tried to leave. And he paused. His throat moved. "That's not what I am. I need you to know what I actually am, even if knowing it doesn't matter anymore." She looked at his face carefully. She'd done this in the board meeting, looked for the thing she could always read in him when it was present, the particular reconfiguration of his language when he was constructing something rather than reporting it. She'd looked for it and not found it there either. She didn't find it now. "When did you find out?" she said. "The day after the board meeting. I sat down with Sungwoo's phone records and financial access logs myself. My own investigation, separate from the board's." His voice was flat in the way it went flat when something was very bad, and he was not going to perform about how bad it was. "He's been running this for almost a year. He recruited Kim Tae-won 6 months before Seo-ah, and I—" He stopped. "Before Seo-ah. He used the marriage to create a conduit. He'd been watching how the corporation operated and finding the seams." "His own brother's corporation," she said. "Yes." And your name never appeared on any of the authorizations. No, he was careful about that. He kept me operationally insulated. He exhaled. Which is its own kind of answer, isn't it? That he knew me well enough to know exactly how much distance to maintain. She looked at the window. A woman outside walking a dog, moving at the dog's pace rather than her own, which was something Zuri had always found inexplicably moving in other people. I believe you, she said. She turned back. About not knowing. Something in his shoulders changed, a shift so small it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 10 years learning to read him. That doesn't resolve most of it, she said immediately. No. Quietly. You married another woman. Yes. You told me in a car, after a dress fitting, the way you tell someone you're restructuring a vendor contract. Yes. His voice was lower now. Not ashamed in the performative sense, just carrying the weight of the thing accurately. You came through that hallway door and looked at a torn dress before you looked at my face. This one moved differently through him. She saw it, the way his eyes shifted down briefly before coming back up, the way his jaw tightened around something he couldn't take back because it had already happened, and both of them knew exactly what it revealed about where his priorities had been without him having to say a single word about it. By the time I understood what had actually happened, he said, you were already in Dana's car. It took you 2 days to find out I'd been to the hospital. He didn't answer that. He didn't answer because there was no answer that improved on the fact, and he'd apparently decided that the version of himself that explained things until they seemed less bad was a version he was retiring. She picked up her tea, drank, set it down. The divorce, she said, filed 5 weeks ago. Her attorneys are contesting the asset terms. She believes the prenuptial doesn't adequately compensate her for reputational damage. He said it without visible emotion. It will conclude. It may take several months, but it will conclude. Zuri nodded. I need to tell you something, she said. He went completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing a situation. The involuntary stillness of someone who has recognized from the quality of those words that what comes next will be significant. She reached into her bag. She took out the small envelope. She opened it and placed the ultrasound copy on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the cafe continued around them, that the espresso machine hissed twice more, that the couple near the window finished their conversation and started a different one. He looked at the image the way people look at things that require them to completely rebuild the structure of what they thought they were walking into. He looked up at her. How far? He said. His voice was different. Something had happened to it in the 10 seconds of looking at that image. 13 weeks. She watched him do the arithmetic the way she'd known he would, the way his eyes moved slightly inward, calculating backward from 13 weeks with the precision of a man who knew how to work with numbers under pressure. Landing on October. Landing on the week of the dress fitting, the week of the car, the week he'd told her nothing had changed. He put his hand over his mouth. He sat with his hand over his mouth and looked at the image on the table, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 10 years. Something that had no layer beneath it, no management, no architecture of control. Just the raw fact of a man learning something that restructured everything simultaneously. He lowered his hand. His eyes were bright. She registered this and set it carefully to the side because there were things she needed to say, and she could not afford to be moved until she'd said them. You've known since before, he started. Since 4 days before the fitting, she said. I was going to tell you that night. I had the ultrasound in my bag at the dress shop. I'd been thinking about how to say it for 3 days. He closed his eyes, just briefly. When he opened them, the brightness was still there, and something else had joined it. An understanding of the full weight of what his particular afternoon in October had cost. Beyond the corporation, beyond the legal architecture, beyond everything that could be rebuilt or restructured or resolved. He'd had a woman in his car carrying news that would have changed the entire trajectory of that conversation, and he had not given her a single moment in which it would have been possible to say it. Zuri, let me finish, she said. He closed his mouth. You are this child's father, she said. That is biological and legal, and I'm not going to obscure it. I'm going to give you access, not immediately and not without structure, but genuinely. Real access, a real relationship, a real presence in their life because that's what the child deserves, and it has nothing to do with what you and I are to each other." She kept her voice even, not cold, precise. "I have already had Ji-hoon draft a custody and paternity framework. It is fair. It is not punitive. It is designed to be workable for both of us long term, because the alternative is creating a legal battlefield that harms the only person in this situation who did nothing wrong." He was listening with an intensity she'd seen in him only in rooms where very high-stakes things were being decided. His whole body leaned slightly forward without him appearing to notice. "What you will not have," she said, and her voice dropped slightly. Not for effect, but because this was the thing that required precision, that required him to hear it exactly as she meant it, "is a path back into my life as a partner, as the person you were. That is finished. It finished in the car in October, and everything that came after confirmed it. And I need you to accept that, genuinely accept it, not as a negotiating position, but as the reality, so that we can both be what this child needs us to be." He was quiet. "Do you understand?" she said. "Yes." He said it the way he'd said yes in the board meeting when Director Choi had stripped his executive authority, not as defeat, not as performance of defeat, but as a man who had looked at the full terrain and made an assessment. "I understand. Are you going to fight the custody terms?" "No." "Are you going to try to use them as leverage for anything else?" "No." She looked at him. She looked at his face for a long moment, the genuine quality of it, the absence of negotiation. "There's one more thing I need from you," she said. He waited. "Sung-woo." She said the name and watched what it did. The particular closing that happened in his expression when the subject arrived, the specific tightening of the muscles around his eyes, that she recognized as the way he managed things that were personally very painful while remaining functional. The investigators are building toward him. The financial trail is documented too thoroughly for his attorneys to dismantle, and they know it. When it closes around him, and it will, within the next few months, I need to know that you will not use whatever remains of your influence in that world to create obstacles. His jaw was working. She could see the muscles in it. "He's your brother," she said, before he could say it. I know what that means in your family and in how you operate. I'm not asking you to stop caring about him. I'm asking you not to interfere with accountability for something that was genuinely criminal and that was partly designed to destroy me if I ever became inconvenient." She paused. "He forged my name, Minjai. He practiced my handwriting. He built a document designed to make me look complicit in crimes I didn't commit. Your brother did that." The silence was enormous. "I know what he did," Minjai said. His voice had gone to somewhere very low and very quiet, and there was something in it that she recognized as the sound of a man who was holding something that was too heavy and had been holding it for several weeks and was not going to put it down in front of anyone, not even now. "I know exactly what he did." "Then let it run," she said. "Let the process run where it goes." He looked at the table for a long moment. She watched his throat move. "All right," he said. "All right. I won't interfere." He looked up. His eyes were steady and dark and full of the cost of the thing he'd just agreed to. "You have my word." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pushed the ultrasound copy an inch toward him across the table. "Keep that," she said. He looked at it. He picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something fragile that you have not yet decided where to put, and he held it without looking at it again, just held it. She stood, picked up her bag, put on her coat. He stood too, automatically, the reflex of 10 years of rising when she moved, and she stopped, and they were standing close in the small space between the table and the wall, closer than they'd been in weeks, and she could see the specific detail of his face that proximity reveals. A small scar at his jaw she knew the story of, the exact shade of his eyes in the gray Thursday light, the slight graying at his temples that had accelerated in the past month. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Be ready when I need you to be a father. That is what matters now. That is the only thing that matters between us now." He looked at her. He didn't speak, but he nodded. A small, definite movement of his head that was not a performance and not a negotiation, and not the nod of a man who still believed he could reverse the direction of things. It was the nod of a man who had arrived, finally and completely, at the true size of his loss, and had decided the only remaining option was to not make it worse. She stepped back. She walked to the door. She pushed it open and went out into the October cold and stood on the pavement and breathed the cold air and let it settle into her lungs. And then she put her hands in her pockets and walked toward the subway. She did not look back. Not because she was performing not looking back, but because there was nothing behind her she needed to see. The night of what would have been her wedding arrived and became something else entirely. She'd spoken to the venue manager, Park Hyunji, a professional with genuine grace who had called personally when the news broke and said only that she was sorry and that the venue was available for whatever purpose Zuri wanted on that date or any other. And they'd redesigned the room in 2 planning sessions that were entirely unlike the wedding planning sessions had been. Less personal, more architectural, the kind of planning she was good at because it required thinking about function and flow and the experience of 63 people moving through a space with intention. Dana had done the rest. Zuri arrived an hour before the guests. The venue manager walked her through without speaking much, which was the right call. The room had been transformed completely. The architectural lighting Dana had specified creating angles that made the space feel contemporary and serious. The product demonstration stations positioned with the natural flow of people moving through an event where they were meant to discover things rather than be presented to. The wedding flowers were gone. The ceremony aisle was gone. In their place was a space that looked exactly like what it was, the launch of something real. She stood at the center of the room. She put her hand briefly on her stomach, 13 weeks and a few days now, not yet visible under the lines of her suit jacket. She breathed. She thought about the hotel stationery. The first concept drawings done in margins and on the backs of room service menus because she hadn't had proper drafting tools yet, and the ideas weren't waiting for proper tools. The borrowed server space. The first 3 patents filed under her name in a legal office in Gangnam, the attorney mildly surprised that she'd come alone without anyone from the corporation. She thought about all the mornings she'd gotten up before Min-jae and worked, not because he'd asked her to be quiet, but because the early hours were hers and the work felt different when it was only hers. Clean, somehow. Accountable only to the problem and not to anyone's idea of what the solution should look like. It felt like this room. The guests arrived at 7. Dana managed the evening with the efficient invisibility of someone who understands that the best event management is the kind that people don't notice. Things are simply where they should be when they should be there, and problems dissolve before becoming visible, and the host is never pulled away from the people she's supposed to be talking to. Zuri stood near the front of the room and talked to people she'd researched carefully and selected specifically. Investors who understood the security sector deeply, technology executives who asked real questions rather than polished ones, international firms that were genuinely looking for what Obsidian Nexus could offer, rather than attending out of curiosity about the public narrative. She answered questions about the platform architecture with the directness of someone who has no distance between herself and the material. She answered questions about the commercial model precisely. She answered one question about the company's founding philosophy, from a woman who ran a mid-sized firm in Singapore and asked it genuinely, as a business person who had built her own thing and wanted to understand the foundation of this one, and thought about it briefly before saying, "We were built to be exactly what we say we are. No distance between the public face and the actual structure. That's not a value statement. It's an operating principle. Everything we design reflects it." The woman from Singapore nodded slowly, the way people nod when they recognize something that matches their own operational framework. At 8:47, the room's energy shifted. She felt it before she saw it. The particular change in the direction of collective attention, 63 people simultaneously orienting toward the entrance without appearing to make a decision to do so. She was mid-sentence with a technology executive from Tokyo, and she finished what she was saying before she turned. Min-jae had come through the door. He was wearing the tuxedo. She recognized it in the first half-second. The cut of it, the specific shade of black that photographers always said photographed differently than standard black. The way it fit him because it had been fitted specifically for him for this event in this room, on a day that had been supposed to mean something else. He was holding the engagement ring. 3 carats, princess cut, in a setting she'd chosen herself from 6 options he'd brought her, the only decision in the entire proposal process that had been genuinely hers. She'd left it on the side table in the mansion the morning she'd packed the apartment. She hadn't thought about it since. Or rather, she'd thought about it once, in the Mappo apartment late at night, and had concluded that thinking about it was not useful, and had not thought about it again. He walked toward her through the room. The crowd separated without being asked, reading the particular gravity of the moment, understanding without briefing that this was not part of the scheduled program and was not, therefore, something to interrupt with questions or conversation. He stopped when there were 5 feet between them. The room was entirely quiet. 63 people, all of them, without a single one having said, "Let's be quiet." She looked at him. He looked at her. His face was open in the specific way it had been open in the cafe, without the armor, without the management, without any of the operational infrastructure he'd spent his adult life building between himself and the things that could reach him. Just him. Which was, she had always thought privately, the most dangerous and the most real version of him. "I know I wasn't on the guest list," he said. His voice was clear and steady, and he wasn't performing. She could always tell the difference, and this was not a performance. "I know I have no claim to this room or this night. I'm not here to make one." He looked around briefly. At the platform demonstration stations, the guests, the architectural lighting, the space that had been rebuilt from the bones of something else into this. He looked at it with the expression of someone seeing a thing that is genuinely impressive and finding themselves unable to pretend otherwise. "You built this," he said. "All of it. From the beginning, from before I knew what it was going to be and the margins of everything else. You built this." He looked back at her. "I wanted to see you launch it, that's all. I wanted to be in the room when it started." She looked at him for a moment. The ring was in his hand, not raised toward her, just held, acknowledged. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I would say if I could say one thing. One real thing, not the legal things, not the things that Ji-hoon's framework already covers." He paused. His jaw tightened briefly, and then released. "I had something real. For 10 years I had something real, and I held it the way people hold things they're certain won't leave. Without care, without attention to whether the holding itself was good. And you left. Not because you stopped loving me, because I stopped seeing you clearly, because I was so certain of you that I stopped looking." He exhaled. "That's mine to carry. I know that. I'm not asking you to take any part of it." The ring was still in his hand. He looked at it. He looked back at her. "I practiced something longer," he said. "I had a whole speech. But standing here..." He stopped. Started again. "I just wanted to say that I know what I lost. Not the corporation, not the platform. You, the specific person. And I know it clearly now, which is the particular cruelty of these things, that clarity tends to arrive after the window closes." The room breathed around them. No one moved. She crossed the 5 feet between them. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the precise quality of his eyes in the room's cold light, close enough to read everything that was happening in his face and confirm that it was real and not managed and not a position. She held out her hand. He looked at it. He understood. She wasn't asking for the ring, she was asking for the ring, and those were different things, and he understood the difference. He placed it in her open palm. She closed her fingers around it. She felt the weight of it, which was familiar and strange simultaneously. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had been the architecture of her life for a decade, who had seen her capability with more clarity than almost anyone she'd ever worked alongside and failed to see her personhood with even basic accuracy, who was standing in the room she'd built wearing the tuxedo for the wedding that never happened, holding nothing in his hands. "You lost me," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear her across the 5 feet between them. "Not to another man, not to the lawsuit, not to the company. You lost me the moment you decided that your certainty about me gave you the right to stop treating me like someone you could lose. That's where it ended. Everything after was just the consequence catching up." His throat moved. "The child is going to need you," she said. "Not the version of you that runs things and keeps score and holds people inside the shape he's decided they fit. The other one. The one that's standing here right now." She paused. "Find a way to make that version the reliable one. That's the work. That's the only thing I actually need from you now." He looked at her. His eyes were bright again, and this time she let herself see it fully. Let herself acknowledge that this was real grief, real understanding, the real cost of a real loss landing in a real person. And then she took a step back. "Go home," she said. Not unkindly. "You've said what you came to say. Let me have this night." He stood for a moment. She watched something move through him. The last calculation, The final check against the possibility that there was anything left to say that would change the shape of what was true. Finding nothing, because there was nothing, because the truth was the truth, and they both knew it and had both known it since the cafe on Thursday morning, and tonight had been something else, a kind of necessary witnessing, a closing that required both of them to be present for it. He nodded. The same small, definite movement as the cafe. He turned and walked toward the door. She watched him walk. She watched the crowd make space for him again, unconsciously, the way it had made space when he'd arrived. She watched the door open and then close behind him. The engagement ring rolled slightly in her closed fist. She stood still for a moment. Then she walked to where Dana was standing at the side of the room with her arms crossed and her expression doing 4 things simultaneously, all of them contained because they were in a professional setting, and Dana understood professional settings. Zuri opened her hand. The ring lay in her palm. Dana looked at it. "Put it somewhere," Zuri said. "I'll figure out what to do with it later. Not tonight." Dana closed her fingers around it without ceremony. "Done." "Do we have everyone we need talking to each other?" "The Singapore group and the Tokyo firm have been in conversation for 20 minutes. It looks good." "The product demonstration stations?" "Running clean. Your technical lead has been at Station 2 for 40 minutes and hasn't stopped talking, which I'm choosing to interpret as a good sign." Zuri straightened her jacket. "Then let's finish this." The evening concluded at 11, not because anyone was asked to leave, but because things that have gone well have a natural resolution point, and this one found it. The last guests left with business cards exchanged, with conversations that would continue on email in the morning, with the particular energy of people who have seen something they'll think about for a few days before deciding what to do with it. Dana locked up. Zuri sat on the edge of one of the demonstration tables while the venue staff moved quietly through the room, beginning the breakdown. And she looked at the space that had been a wedding venue, and then something else entirely, and was now returning to neutrality. "How do you feel?" Dana said, sitting beside her. Zuri thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "and clear." "Clear is good. Clear is very good." She looked at the room. 3 letters of intent by end of week. I think the Singapore group, Matsuda from Tokyo, and possibly the firm from Johannesburg, who didn't say much but kept coming back to the encryption demonstration. "The quiet ones are always the serious ones," Dana said. "We need to have the commercial terms document ready by Monday." "I'll have it drafted by Sunday." They sat for a moment in the quieting room. "He looked," Dana started, and then stopped. "I know," Zuri said. "He actually looked sorry." "I know." Zuri picked up her bag from beside the table. "That doesn't change what happened, but I know." Dana nodded. She looked at her own hands for a moment. "What happens now? With him? With all of it?" "Jihoon manages the legal pieces. The custody framework goes to his attorneys Monday. The forensic investigation runs where it runs. I'm done managing it. I gave them everything they need." She stood. "And I go to work. Every day. I build the thing I'm building." "And the baby?" Zuri put her hand on her stomach briefly. "And the baby," she agreed. Dana looked at her. The full look, the one that had been part of 23 years of friendship, that contained the entire history of knowing someone. "You're going to be good at this," she said. "The mother thing, you know that, right?" Zuri looked at her for a moment. Something in her chest that she didn't name. "I'm going to try like hell," she said, which was the more accurate answer, and Dana accepted it the way she accepted most honest things, with a nod and no argument. The investigation concluded in stages over the following months, the way these things conclude, not dramatically, not with a single moment, but incrementally, each development arriving in Jihoon's office in the form of documented findings and formal proceedings that Zuri reviewed when they arrived, and then returned to the folder and continued with her day. Kim Tae-won cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure, which produced the documentation that confirmed what Zuri had already known, that the forged signature had been prepared in his office, that the Haneul arrangement had been his design executed in partnership with Kang Sung-woo, that Min-jae's name appeared nowhere in the authorization chain because Sung-woo had been careful about exactly that. The cooperation also produced something she hadn't anticipated, a recorded conversation between Taiwan and Sung-woo from 11 months ago in which Sung-woo discussed, in specific terms, The plan to use the forged document to neutralize Zuri if she ever moved against the corporation. She listened to the recording once in Ji-hoon's office, with her hands flat on the table. She didn't listen to it again. Han Seo-ah's attorneys negotiated. They negotiated for 6 weeks and eventually produced a settlement that required the return of the Singapore funds and Seo-ah's cooperation with the criminal investigation in exchange for a reduced civil exposure. SEOA cooperated. She returned to Busan. The entertainment media covered this with the breathless enthusiasm it brought to all related developments, and Zuri read the coverage once and then closed the tab and did not open another one. Kang Sung-woo was indicted in January. It was a Tuesday. Ji-hoon called her with the news at 9:15 in the morning, and she was in the middle of reviewing a technical specification document, and she said thank you and ended the call and went back to the specification document because that was what there was to do and it was what she did. Min-jae did not interfere. She knew this because Ji-hoon tracked it and reported to her as she'd asked him to, and because the process ran clean without the obstruction that Min-jae, if he'd chosen to apply it, had the residual capacity to create. He'd kept his word from the cafe in Yongsan, which cost him something she understood without needing it explained. She didn't tell him she'd noticed, but she had. Course from Seo-ah finalized in March. Ji-hoon mentioned it in the same sentence as a licensing renewal question, matter of fact, the way you mention something that has concluded and requires no further action. Zuri nodded and answered the licensing question. Her daughter was born in May on a Wednesday morning, 6 days ahead of schedule, in a way that felt characteristic, efficient about the process, done before Zuri had fully adjusted to the fact that it was happening. The nurses calm and competent, and the room bright with the specific morning light of Seoul in late spring. She came out with a sound that was small and definitive, and which Zuri would spend several weeks trying to find the right words for, and eventually stop trying, because some sounds don't require description so much as witnessing. Dana was in the waiting area, as specified, and came in afterward and held the baby with the particular care of someone who intends to mean something to this person for the long term and is already taking it seriously. She called Min-jae from the hospital room at 2 in the afternoon. He answered on the second ring. "She's here," Zuri said. "Healthy, this morning." The sound on his end of the line was a pause that was not a pause, a breath held and then released in a specific way. "Can I come?" he said. "Yes." "Come to the hospital. Text when you're in the lobby." He arrived 40 minutes later. He came into the room in the careful way of someone who understands they are in a space they have not been invited to take up, who is calibrating how much of himself to bring in. He looked at Zuri first, checking, the way he'd always checked people he was responsible to before doing the thing he'd come to do. And she nodded, and he crossed the room. Dana had moved to the window. Zuri held the baby toward him. He took her. She watched him hold his daughter for the first time, and she watched his face and she did not look away from it, because whatever he was feeling was real, and it was his. And she'd decided in the hospital room the night she'd called Ji-hoon from a hospital bed that she was not going to make the facts of this situation smaller than they actually were. The facts were that this was a person he'd made and who was going to need him and who was currently, at approximately 4 hours old, doing what 4-hour-old people do, existing with the concentrated intensity of someone for whom existence is still entirely new. He stood there for a long time. Nobody spoke. Dana was at the window. Zuri was in the hospital bed watching. The room had the particular quiet of a moment that everyone present understands is significant without being able to say exactly why. He looked up eventually. His eyes were bright and his jaw was tight around whatever was in his chest that he was not going to say out loud. Not here, not now. And she was glad for that restraint because she was not in a condition to manage anything that required significant emotional navigation. "What's her name?" he said. "Naya," Zuri said. "Naya Zuri Thompson." He looked at the name. He was quiet for a moment. "Naya," he said, just the word quietly, learning the weight of it, the way you say a new word when you want to know how it sits in the mouth. He stayed 40 minutes. He left when she needed to rest, without being asked, without making it into an exit. He handed the baby back to the nurse who appeared at the right moment, and he looked at Zuri from across the room. "Thank you," he said, "for calling me." She looked at him. "She's going to need you to show up," she said, "consistently, Not dramatically, just consistently. I know. He meant it. She could see that he meant it. Then that's what matters, she said. He left. The door closed. Dana came away from the window and sat in the chair beside the bed, and they sat together in the quiet room while the nurse settled Naya into the bassinet and the May light moved slowly across the ceiling. How do you feel? Dana said. Zuri looked at her daughter in the bassinet, the small face, the precise and inexplicable fact of her. Like I built something that matters, she said. Dana was quiet for a moment, then, yeah, she said. You did. 2 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, Zuri signed the final page of a framework agreement in a conference room in Singapore overlooking the harbor. The pen was one she'd bought herself from a stationery shop near the Singapore office. Not the designer kind, not ceremonial, just a good pen that did what a pen is supposed to do. She signed her name with it and set it down and looked at what she'd signed. A partnership framework establishing Obsidian Nexus as the primary cybersecurity infrastructure provider for a consortium spanning 6 countries and 4 major financial institutions. 3 years of work, from the first concept conversations to this room. Dana signed her documents across the table with the comfortable authority of a woman who had been doing significant things for 2 years and had stopped being surprised by the scope of them, which was the right way to feel at this level of the work. The celebration dinner afterward was good, warm, genuine, the kind of professional celebration that has real feeling in it, because the people around the table actually did something together and know it. She ate well for the first time in a week of travel. She talked with the Singapore partners and found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation, which was not always guaranteed with professional dinners and was therefore something she noticed. She went back to the hotel at 10. She checked in with the babysitter in Seoul, who reported that Naya had eaten well and gone down without difficulty and was currently asleep with the gray elephant she'd been carrying everywhere for the past 6 months, one of its ears slightly misshapen from the carrying. She thanked the babysitter. She ended the call. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed and took off her shoes and looked at the harbor through the window. The lights of the bridges, the dark water between them, the ordinary nighttime architecture of a city that had nothing to do with any of the things that had made her. She thought about the bridal shop in Seoul. October. White satin, $4,200. The seamstress fixing a seam at the shoulder. She thought about the car ride home. She thought about sitting on the floor of the Mapo apartment hallway, with her back against the wall because sometimes the floor is the right height for what you're carrying. She thought about Park Ji-hoon's conference table and the documents in the sequence she'd laid them out. She thought about Dana driving her to the hospital at midnight, one hand on the wheel, the other close. She thought about a heartbeat on a monitor, fast and regular, in a room she'd been in alone. She picked up her phone. She called home. The babysitter held the phone and Naya appeared on the screen. 2 years old, walking with the emphatic determination of someone who has mastered the mechanism and is entirely unbothered by the efficiency. She was carrying the elephant. She held it up for the camera the moment she saw the screen. Elephant, she said, with the gravity of someone delivering important news. Elephant, Zuri confirmed. Naya seemed satisfied with this confirmation. She toddled off screen and came back and held up the elephant again from a slightly different angle, in case the original presentation had been unclear. I see it, Zuri said. I see the elephant, baby. Naya considered this. Then she looked at the screen directly, at Zuri's face, with the particular focus of a 2-year-old who has located the person she wanted and is now content with the information, and said simply, Mama. Hi, Zuri said, something in her chest that she did not try to name. She said goodnight and ended the call and sat in the Singapore hotel room with the harbor light moving across the ceiling, and she was 36 years old, and she ran a company that she'd built from hotel stationery and borrowed servers, in the early morning hours that had always been hers. And she had a daughter who held elephants toward cameras with the seriousness of a scientist presenting findings. And she had a life that was complicated and demanding and full of the specific difficulty of building things. And none of it had been easy and none of it had been given, and every floor she was standing on she had poured herself. She lay back on the bed. She looked at the ceiling. The harbor light moved. She breathed. Somewhere in Seoul, in a corporation that had been restructured 3 times and was slowly becoming something that might eventually be worth what it claimed, Kang Min-jae was working in an office that felt different than it used to, building something smaller and more honest than what he'd had. carrying the particular education of a man who had been shown the full cost of underestimating something irreplaceable and had arrived at a version of himself that knew better. He would show up for Naya. He had been showing up for Naya, at the time specified in the custody framework, consistently, without drama, in the way she'd asked him to. She knew this not because she monitored it, but because Naya recognized him now, turned toward him at pickup, called him by the word she was working on for father, and the quality of a child's recognition does not lie. She didn't think about him long. She had an 8 o'clock meeting and a full day behind it and a flight home on Saturday that she was already looking forward to in the specific way you look forward to returning to the particular life you've built, the one that is exactly the shape it should be, difficult and real and entirely yours. She closed her eyes. The harbor moved outside. The city did what cities do. She slept. And in a nursery in Seoul, Naya Zuri Thompson slept with a gray elephant tucked against her chest, one ear soft from being carried everywhere, dreaming the unrecorded dreams of someone who has arrived recently into the world and finds it, so far, full of things worth holding up toward the light and naming.